concert there. I'll just play you. For some reason, the Vimeo stuff is just not looking. It's just not.
So how was it received? And did you a discussion? Like, what did people want to talk about?
Well, it was a big concert, so it was thousands of people. It wasn't more like, this was very small and like kind of intimate. But if you're doing a concert, it's a concert. So we projected it throughout the opera house part of the Hermitage, which for Russia is this, palace of art. And then we had a Tate Modern for the 10th anniversary. And we had about, the clip, it's annoying, it just won't play. Let me try one other version. That was a concert as well. I had them put out about 6,000 pillows throughout the Tate Modern. And it was, it was a really successful concert. And they had me and Thirsty Moore from Sonic Youth, who's an old associate as well. Hopefully this will, yeah, there we go. What's it called? What's it called? Yeah. But we had a great show, and the idea was the reason I wanted to show you this was to show you how we put pillows throughout the museum, and then I projected the film and rescored it live using the iPad, and had all the software based on apps that let you rescore film. So I don't know if you can't see it because I have the iPad and I'm controlling all of the sounds from the iPad, including all the projection. So regretfully, again, you can't really see, but there's the turbo. Has anybody here been to the Tate?
Yeah.
Okay.
Some of my work was actually at that same thing.
Okay. Well, we projected it throughout the turbine hall. Again, you can't see. Goddamn. It's this huge hall, and the idea was to break the film up into small loops and then project it throughout the hall and put pillows out throughout the museum so that everyone would get different perspectives. Because right now you can't see it, but there's about 6,000 plus people sitting on pillows. On my computer, you can see it fine, but you can't. So everyone's lying down watching small fragments of this film projected. And the idea, again, non-linear processes, pulling together this idea of modern storytelling in digital media with something that's from post-revolutionary, the idea of everyday life. And Vertov was really an important figure for that. Most film historians will probably acknowledge that Man with the Camera was one of the more important films for breaking the idea of storytelling out of the idea of characters, and everyone who was the camera, who engaged the camera's lens, was an actor. So,
can I ask you a quick question? When you were, did you do translation for either of the languages that are presented in the work?
No, I left it in Russian. But there's subtitles. If you for the DVD, if you press play and put the DVD in your computer, there's subtitles.
Right, but I mean, for public performance,
I'd like
not to include translation for the Russian subtitle.
No, I just wanted people to watch it in the original version. Even though I'm breaking it up, remixing it, and doing all sorts of stuff, there's something that's so beautiful about the fonts of that era, and the way the Russian Revolutionary font was very cool. And I looked for ways to simulate it in English. My editing team were trying to figure out cool, interesting looking fonts. So I'll just show you this really quick. This is the DVD of the project. So we ended up, we used defont.com and fine-tuned and tailored some English versions of it. But it's still, it wasn't satisfactory for me. But, so that's why I didn't include it in the actual.
I was just curious about the content of the original film coming through it.
Yeah, I left it. That's.
We had it in Russian.
I know, but that's not what that was.
And I have extra copies. I mean, does anyone want the copy of the DVD? It's a beautiful film from.
I have
here I have 2 or 3. I have more back in my room.
Well, you know, rip it, and then I can give it away.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Well, I was wondering.
So you 3 share this one, and then you guys here. That works.
When I saw your remix, you introduced some introductions of your own, like this VJ remix.
That's all right, I'm sure.
No, I was just wondering if you think, well, if you did it, you thought that perhaps you needed to put them inside. But what I like it in The Man of the Moving Camera, when I saw it for the first time, it just in the introduction, he states, well, this is pictures of real life without intertitles.
Yeah.
And then I like it a lot, you know, because it's very different from he's not telling a story. It's very different from the way they did cinema at the time. Well, and I was just wondering, didn't you thought doing this remix without putting your own intertitles? No, without putting your... Yeah, I don't know. I was just wondering, you think that perhaps without your intertitles, would people still understand your idea about that because you already did new music for that, you already sampled in a way the film? I was just wondering if you could not have introduced your...
By the way, that was the trailer. It was not that. You guys, there's 2 things at hand. One, he did 3 projects at the beginning of his film career that were very influential. One was called Kino-glaz, which means film truth. The other was called Kino-glaz, which is on the DVD that you guys are getting. And then the other one, later on, was called Man with the Camera, which is probably the most important or most well-known of the 3. What I presented was Kino-glaz, which means the cinema eye, which has elements that he took later on and made a full-length kind of thing. Kino-glaz was intertitles. There was all this weird commentary visually on everything in the film that was pretty intense. But he wanted to get to a pure language of cinema, a pure grammar of cinema, and he called it visual rhythm. So what he would do is he'd edit the scenes in the film that were so rapidly shifting that you would create a kind of a pattern. And there was not necessarily a narrative per se. It's just weird, random fragments of everyday life. And that's where I think it's got this resonance with our current digital media of stuff like YouTube or Facebook, or these affinity groups that people carry cameras around. Everyone's documenting small fragments of things and uploading, downloading, sending fragments to friends. So he was a director who's trying to engage that as an art form in its own right. So the idea was decentering the idea of the author. It's not the idea of the death of the author, because there's one person who eventually ends up becoming the director. But what he's doing is decentering the idea of how you tell a story, how you put together an art object. And he considered the film as an art piece in its own right. So what we did with the tape, which again, if you can't see, was take the film, break it into small fragments, project it around, and
the walls and the ceiling.
Both walls, ceiling, everywhere as much as possible. And the main place was the screen where I was DJing, but we broke it up into small component elements. So Kino-glaz, that was projected at the museum. But you're right. I mean, there's issues around how I think Soviet revolutionary cinema was critiquing Hollywood. And what was happening was that the rock star of that time was D.W. Griffith. And I also got the rights to his film, Birth of a Nation, which I'm going to show later on today. But again, if we're looking at the 20th century, you could argue that film was the basic grammar of visuality, and the way that film would represent a certain kind of currency of truth, and it represented an artist and a lyrical. When I say an artist, I'm talking about Jean Cocteau versus D.W. Griffith, or Jean Cocteau versus Vertov. One of the things that each of those guys dances around is that their films still have a relationship to reality. Even if it's Jean Cocteau talking about Blood of a Poet, what makes a surrealist film versus a story is that the characters are doing radically unexpected things. They're vanishing through walls. They're walking on the ceiling. They're talking to statues. In Griffith, you'll never see that. Or Vertov, you won't see that either. They're both dealing with this idea of constructed realism. And with Griffith, you got to remember, he's considered to be the man who invented Hollywood. He wanted to have a story that was so, true, that would become the actual thing. So a lot of people felt that Birth of a Nation had actually happened, for example. And later on, you had someone like Orson Welles, who I was talking about earlier. He did this film, not really a film, a theater piece called War of the Worlds, where he played records and was DJing a theater piece, and people thought the world was being invaded by aliens, and there were riots. People started running through the streets. But I'm going to get to that in a little bit right after this. So In terms of the bullet points I was talking about earlier, the crisis of realism, Zig Vertov, Orson Welles, and then we saw Ramin Barani, who've now seen an example from Vertov. What I'm going to do is play one of Orson Welles' records, and I want you to just kind of get into that from the viewpoint of an art form based on collage that's meant to represent something true, but it's actually completely false. And what ended up happening is people were rioting in Times Square. The army was called out, because he made it seem like he was a radio DJ playing in the middle of an interrupted theater piece, and the interruption was that I have an announcement to make. We're being invaded by aliens, something like that. It was totally like off the wall, but people didn't have the vocabulary to decode or pull the realism apart, so they took it at face value.
Actually, as I understand it, it's been a while, but at the beginning of War of the Worlds, there was actually a disclaimer that said, this is not real, this is not actually an event, this is just a thing. But what happened was, at that time, there was a very popular show that preceded the Orson Welles, and people at that, they would switch from the end of the last show to the beginning of the first show, and a vast majority of the audience missed that original disclaimer.
Because it was on another stage.
And actually,
that's right.
Georgia, the country, a couple months ago, they just did a video, like, what happens if Russia invades again? And people thought it was news, because they did it in the form of a news story. So it's the same exact thing.
Yeah, when you do something in the form of a news story. But, by the way, do you guys want a copy of this? I can put it in the folder that I'm eventually going to bounce to the memory stick.
Yes.
Okay, I'll bounce this as well. It's pretty rare. I collect old records. Cool. All right, so let's play the original record. This is the record version. And so he recorded it while he was making it and then eventually made a vinyl. And I got the first edition of it, which is, again, it's bragging rights. It's a long story, but it's a rare record.
The Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations present Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the Air in The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells.
Just as a quick vote, how much do you guys want to hear? Do you want to just hear the beginning so you get a vibe of it and then we'll move on, or do you guys actually
I've already heard it.
Okay. So that's one vote for no. Do you guys want to hear a lot of it, or just like a quick excerpt?
Just a little bit.
Okay. Okay. So, all right.
Ladies and gentlemen, the director of the Mercury Theater and star of these broadcasts, Orson Welles.
We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man, and yet as mortal as his own. We know now that as human beings busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacence, people went to and fro the earth about their little affairs, serene in the assurance of their dominion over this small, spinning fragment of solar driftwood, which by chance or design, man has inherited out of the dark mystery of time and space. Yet across an immense ethereal gulf, minds that are to our minds as ours are to the beasts in the jungle, intellects vast, cool, and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. In the 39th year of the 20th century came the Great Disillusionment. Near the end of October, business was better.
His voice just kind of switches gears, and now he's starting the story, but he's been kind of building it up. And I love the way that Orson Welles, he was an actor, but he was also a director, and he was very deeply competitive with Alfred Hitchcock, who was also one of my favorite directors. And I love that one phrase, mind is vast, cool, and unsympathetic. He just has this gravitas. It's just like he's an incredible storyteller. So what I want to do is now show you guys one of his later films, which is called F for Fake. And again, I'm hoping we can get some kind of, it's a brilliant film where he interviews Europe's top counterfeit painter, And so what he's done is he then splices in clips of him reading from War of the Worlds. And it's just a kind of a very quirky art film. But the idea here is, all right, some of the things we've been talking about, pattern recognition, and the idea of realism is that you have a consistent pattern that you put one foot in front of the other, the world doesn't fall apart. You're looking at this idea that the phenomenology of like the real, you know, what that means in the 20th century versus 21st is the editing process now, the consistency of information that we use to construct a narrative, a film, a painting, a video file. That is something that I think Orson Welles, if you look at Citizen Kane, that's one of the most important films of the 20th century, hands down. Like any film critic can tell you. Have most of you guys seen Citizen Kane? Yeah. Okay, that was incredibly innovative editing techniques, really smart way of controlling the narrative of the story. But above all, Orson Welles got blacklisted, so he wasn't able to make that many films afterwards because he had crossed this one publisher. And I don't want to get too, that's a whole different tangent. But he eventually got so angry with Alfred Hitchcock because Alfred Hitchcock was taking a lot of the people that Orson Welles had worked with, and that's why all of a sudden he was sampling Orson Welles' style. You see, so a lot of the narrative structure of Alfred Hitchcock's films, the editors that Orson Welles worked with, the screenwriter guys, everybody, he just took. So it's like you would be pissed off. They really had a bitter hatred. And it's two of my favorite guys. It's just too bad because I think Alfred Hitchcock's a brilliant filmmaker, and I think Orson Welles is a brilliant filmmaker. It's like the same thing with the de Kooning erasure painting. You know this one in art history. It's a very famous moment where these two painters are supposed to do a collaboration, and one guy just erases the other guy's.
It's Rauschenberg erasure.
Yeah, Rauschenberg erasure. So let me just play you a quick clip of this so that you can hear. You just heard it of sort of an audio version, and let's get you into the visual. Just 1 second.
For my next experiment, ladies and gentlemen, I would appreciate the loan of a very small personal object from your pocket, a key, a box of matches, a coin. Here it is. Good, sir. Hold it up 10 feet over your head, and watch out for the slightest hint of hanky-panky. Behold, before our very eyes.
Wow, it's really good.
You can play it and play here.
Oh yeah, just go to YouTube. If you guys all want to just watch a quick clip of it, just type in F for fake, and it'll pop up as the video. As a matter of fact, just to save time, I can put that link in the PDF so that everyone has a little reference point. We'll just go from there.
I'd like to point out something that I think is kind of problematic.
Okay.
Just a bit of background. I put together the San Francisco Performance Cinema Symposium back in 2003, and what we're talking about was one of the problematic issues that came up, which is the question of narrativity. And I think it's a very it's a problem that I think isn't really being solved very well by any of this. We're narrative creatures. The fact that I can string words together and you're understanding it, it demonstrates, the fact that we're narrative animals. Our brains work that way. When you take something like Vertov and hack it to pieces and throw it on top of some music, which is the classic VJ practice, and has been for quite some time, you're basically removing narrativity. So it evacuates the necessity of Vertov. And so you can have basically just about anything up there. You don't even have to have Vertov, you have somebody copying Vertov. And it becomes, so it's a layer of abstraction. And you eliminate the narrativity within Vertov's film, which is what makes the whole film hang together. It becomes a pastiche.
But a film is already made of edited moments already.
But that doesn't matter, because the edited moments are arranged. It's like a word is an edit.
Are you familiar with Walter Fisher's narrative paradigm?
No.
Okay, it is what you're talking about. It's he basically goes through and sort of a communication scholar. I think it's Walter Fisher with a C. Anyway, and he goes through and outlines this. But one of the things is, especially if you get into an oral culture, it's a necessity that, pre-extrasomatic memory, so before there was hard drives, any paper, before you had any sort of recording system, it was necessarily copied every time, and necessarily changed every time it was copied.
Exactly, yeah.
And so then to say that it's losing something in the act of copying or in the act of sort of rehashing it, I think is actually going totally against the oral tradition. The oral tradition is based upon the fact that stories will change as they are retold.
Yeah. But the thing is that I'm saying that there's a story.
Well, I think that
the story comes first, you see. Then you have to have that narrative.
But there are other ways
Otherwise.
of making connections. Like it's not traditional narrative, and it's a new version is strong. It has its own voice. It must be strong.
And it relates to the original narrative.
To become a new.
That becomes a narrative.
Well,
you're applying a different criteria of judgment, and I think that there's a little bit of, when you're talking about a problematic, the idea of collage was very problematic for the jazz guys, for example. They hated hip-hop, and there was this huge war when hip-hop really started becoming more popular. All the jazz guys lined up to diss it, and they said, collage, these kids are like just playing records, and just playing with everything. Now, Vertov, on the other hand, he celebrated the fact that that's why he did Kino-glaz and Small Fragments, by the way. They were usually meant to be bits and pieces that would be projected at like a Soviet rally, or they were non-linear. They would be film happenings where he actually carried a film projection studio with him in a lot of places, and they would just set up randomly and project. So Vertov, I think, if you go to a little bit of the texture of what he was doing, the collage aesthetic was pretty much part and parcel of his whole work process. And the editing process and the way it was done with his brother, they always thought of it as a vibrant text that was always transforming and evolving. Ramin Barani, on the other hand, no, I wouldn't probably cut up the plastic bag film, for example. That's a very specific kind of thing. When I'm doing projects, each project is radically different.
Right.
The Cocteau film, for example, we're going to present that at the Guggenheim in the Spiral, and I'm going to have a small dance ensemble interpret each scene in the film. And so we're working with this choreographer that works with Bill T. Jones, who's a very renowned choreographer.
Right.
And I'm having a string quartet play my compositions that will be transformed by the audience in a way, because we're going to have the audience have an iPhone app that lets them text in the motifs that they kind of vote on, or everyone will have. It's a long story, but when we're going to have it at October at the Guggenheim, the first thing the Guggenheim said, you're violating Cocteau's film, you're going to be switching music, and you're going to be cutting and sampling. But that's
why'd you commission me?
Well, no, that's okay. I mean, there's some times where you'll just let something, the original version, play.
Yeah.
But this is a problem of artists who appropriate. Plagiarism are always going to have, over the, So I consider my work practice of appropriation a kind of both homage and an irreverent take on the other artist's work.
Right.
So if you're Jeff Koons, if you're Andy Warhol, if you're Shep Ferry, all sorts of people, we get it now. I mean, the idea of copying and sampling and plagiarism and textual appropriation, that's part of the vocabulary most kids are dealing with. Now, when you're talking about cutting up a film and Vertov and VJing, I think I don't think he wouldn't be against it. It's
I agree, but it's one of the reasons why I stopped doing VJ work, is because I just found the whole scene. Remember, I was talking about how hybridity leads to euphoria. It's exactly that. You just walk into this bleh of video goo. And you go to one after the other, it's all the same crap.
Well, they said the same thing about punk when punk started. They said the same thing about hip hop and hip hop. You're applying DJ technique to film.
Yeah, but the thing is that the results are almost indistinguishable from one another.
No, I disagree.
This is where you become an old fogey.
You're sounding very cranky on that.
Well, I just get so many of them, and I just get so sick of it. I just look at it like, oh God, if I see another clip from Koyaanisqatsi over a 4/4 kick beat, I'm just going to throw up.
No, I don't do that.
I know you don't do that, because but it's
Paul, when you were re-editing, doing that mix, what did you have another new structure or idea in mind, or what guided your
I had to go to Moscow. There's this crazy museum called the Russian Museum of History of Soviet Cinema. you go into this crazy museum downtown Moscow near Red Square. It's a bombed out. Anybody here been to Russia? Like half the spaces are falling apart. Everything's fucked up. It's like bombed out. So you go into this weird basement where they have all the reels from literally like the Russian Revolution. And I'm like, holy shit. The reels are rotting. Nobody's preserving them. They're just like, you want to talk about goo and stuff. I mean, there's a leak on the wall. You can see it just like had gotten onto the film. The celluloid was all messed up. So I was like, we got to do a high definition print of this. So we did a linear, when you do a high definition print of an old film, a lot of times you have to literally reproject it. Then you record the projection and do what they call high definition recording. You then pull that into the computer. You can treat all the different like layers and stuff, and you make a very rich kind of print of it. So the DVD that you guys got is from the Russian Museum, and they let me do this whole read. I didn't change it too much because I really wanted to have a very high quality print. So it's not all cut up, but for the live version, what we did was projected in all sorts of angles, all sorts of stuff. And the idea to put pillows down and ask the audience to lie down and kind of get into this, the normal film viewing process is that you're sitting in a chair like this and you're kind of, front forward. I wanted to feel like it's immersive. So we put in a sound system where I could control the speakers all around the room, the sounds are moving around. If you saw an image go like that, the sound of that image, stuff like that. So eventually the whole place was moving and the sounds were going in a way that it was a very beautiful concert. The Brits flipped out about it. We had historians from Russia that were in London that came to the concert. We had all sorts of people. And there's no way in hell the Russians would ever give you the Hermitage if you're a fine artist, the Hermitage is like their,
Holy Grail.
Yeah, what's that?
It's like their holy grail.
Yeah, so I'm the first electronic music artist to ever do anything there, and the curators don't even let digital art in the museum. So they're strictly painting, sculpture, So even when I have my production meeting with the Guggenheim curators, and we had to go through this whole thing of, is it copyright violation if I'm messing with another artist's film? Is it this or that, or if I'm appropriating? Is it, what's the art form? I'm sure you guys know Christian Marklein. We were talking about him the other day. I'm not a fan. He does the kind of cut up, like just random juxtaposition and somebody just saying hello, which, to me that would drive me nuts. Yeah. I'd much rather have an immersive experience and have a kind of, my motto for all these projects is director as DJ, and the idea is that we're looking at the component elements of culture right now, where everyone is essentially a sampler. We're all pulling from fragments of media, we're all pulling links, we're all sending files back and forth. So the DJ motif is now a central, I think, culture production method right now. So I understand how different generations will approach the creative act, but at the end of the day, the vocabulary that I deal with I think it's part of the DNA of our time right now.
I'm not saying that the process, I'm not saying the technique is wrong. I'm just saying that the way that it's too often implemented.
Okay. Are you into normal like painting and sculpture, or
sorry?
Are you into more traditional art forms? Is that where?
No, I do that.
Okay.
I've done VJ work. I've done many performances. I've done videos for MTV style video stuff. I've done plenty of work that way. That's not the problem. My beef is basically with modernism's rejection of narrativity, and because what it is it's a conceit. Okay. Well, it is it's just a displacement of narrativity. Instead of the object providing narrative, what you do is you look at the object. It gives you a sequence of images that Eisenstein's theory has been misapplied.
Yeah, montage.
Yeah, that whole thing, and so what happens is the real narrativity is the story around it, and the explanation and the social context. And that becomes the story that we understand this by. Mm-hmm. And so, which I find pathetic.
Okay, but I think that at the end of the day, montage is still dealing with a kind of analog of celluloid. Once you get to stuff like Final Cut Pro, and once you get into this digital editing process, the actual process of putting together anything is going to be based on this kind of cut up and splice and dice. Mm-hmm. So that would mean you would probably hate William S. Burroughs, you wouldn't like Marshall McLuhan, you wouldn't like what's been going on with neo-expressionist stuff like Jackson Pollock's stream of consciousness, movement over the canvas. You wouldn't like Merce Cunningham. You wouldn't like Grandmaster Flash. You're looking for this idea of linear narrative. That's what it sounds like. That's
no, I'm saying it doesn't have to be linear. It just has to be a narrative.
But why are you addicted to narrative?
Because that's how the brain works. When I go into
then how does it produce these other things like Pollock?
I go into I can't stand Pollock.
so because you can't understand that.
No. I actually prefer Klein and Still. I think that they're much more interesting painters. I think Pollock was a one-trick pony and he drank himself to death because of it. But
no, I love the idea of subjectivity and I love the idea of contrariness. But I do think that we have to accept in some capacity that most kids in the environment that I grew up in, that my artwork reflects, is this kind of hyper-collage narrative. That's just the way I grew up. So,
as I said, the process doesn't bother me. It's just that too often when these are very powerful tools, and when used creatively and intelligently, it's a beautiful thing. And I'm not disagreeing with that. The problem is the tools are too often used in an unthinking and unimaginative way. And so you just throw a bunch of crap together and it's largely indistinguishable from anything else.
I think though that exists in narrative structures. I think it exists everywhere. I mean, I don't think that's, exceptional to this
It's
form.
the idea of quality.
I think there's accessibility because you can take, you can go on the internet, you can take images and do that stuff. But I think that exists in every form.
Now, hear me out on this. Let's start with the very basic elements of, let's take, an art form, and let's not argue about this right away, of music, okay? So we've got music, and you have one tone, okay? Now, you have a single tone, which if you played for, 50 minutes, you'd probably get really sick of it and hate it. It's one tone, it's stupid. So you need to create some sort of narrative with that tone. Now, in a lot of ways, there is no structure to that. There is no underlying sort of reason why you would put, say, 15, 20 different tones in a sequence to create a piece of music. So in some ways, it is the aesthetics of the piece. You can look at...
right, which is what I was just talking about. It's the narrative becomes the story around the piece.
No. There is no story around the piece. The piece exists on its own as simply an aesthetic. So you could take a VJ, and there could be nothing. There is no story behind it. You could have it created by Wolfram and his crazy computer algorithm system. But if the thing is aesthetically appealing, then just as so, it has the same draw as music. It is aesthetically appealing not because there is any sort of narrative or not because there is any sort of structure, simply because it is aesthetically appealing.
All I can say is that you have to imagine that anything goes and move from there. If we're talking about Vertov or Jean Cocteau, you're talking about this idea of unconscious logic, associative logic. Cocteau really felt that his films were this kind of unconscious poetry that was being manifested by using the actors to enact poetry. That was called physical poetry. He even called his films algorithms because he felt that the poetry was meant to be almost an algebra or grammar. Right. So everything you're saying, at the end of the day, we are living in a hyper-relative, relativity is a kind of a function of when everyone is a media producer. So if everyone here is a democratized individual, being able to be creative, your computer's a mini studio, and you're going to be able to do your own style in your own way, but you're still using these tools, right? They're going to have a grammar that comes out of this. The QWERTY keyboard even has a very rigorous logic to it. When you're typing, the way that the interface of that camera, the buttons are going to be touching, they all drive a certain logic of selection.
Right.
So I hear you. What I'm trying to figure out as an artist right now, 2010, is, okay, if I get approached to do a museum show, and I don't want to do a normal, installation, sculpture, painting, and so on.
Right.
If I want to, on one hand, somebody like Doug Aitken just did a film where the whole film was a microphone being put into the middle of the ground in Brazil. Like, he sent a microphone down a mile. So the camera follows this microphone just kind of going down. That's cool, it's fine, it's sort of quirky art thing. Now, if I want to use archived materials, which is records, and you're thinking about playing with the archive, which is disrupting those records, my precedents are going to be people like the free verse kind of movement in France in the turn of the last century, the imagists, Apollinaire with the cut-up technique, stuff like that. Do you feel that modernist movement to get away from narrative, if you look at the futurists, Say, for example, they're almost the epitome of saying, let's blow up the museums, let's blow up the opera houses, let's erase the symphonies. We want the sound of the machine. We want the machine all the time. They wanted to do symphonies of machine gun bullets flying. They wanted to do symphonies of noise generators.
Yeah, well, I use that in my classes.
So, do you think that they were a wrong turn? Like, that people should have stuck to the normal symphony? And on the other hand, like, Philip Glass now is almost a return to Eric Satie and all this other stuff.
Oh, yeah, I know.
You know,
it's, I think that it's, well, I think the industrialism, which is underneath all of this, the substructure itself was a major wrong turn. And so I would say that the economic substructure is what is the real problem. The capitalist industrialism. I think that futurism and modernism are simply symptomatic of this dissociation process. It's almost like it's almost autistic in a way. I'm not a big fan of. Well, one of my little catchphrases is postmodernism is a false consciousness based on a mistaken idea. Okay, and the postmodernism is the false consciousness based on the bad idea, which was modernism itself. So it's not to reject the products of it, because we have no choice in that.
But you're looking for authenticity. You're saying that the authentic subject, the authentic statement of the subject.
No, I actually had a discussion just a minute ago with Sharif about this. No, the authenticity, everything's automatically authentic because we're here doing it.
But so you're using the term false consciousness, which has a very specific relationship to Hegelian dialectics, to Jean-Paul Sartre's idea of existentialism.
Yeah, I was actually thinking more about Lukács, but...
Okay, but he's probably riffing from them. Yeah. So when you're talking about the idea of false consciousness, that's something that talks about the inauthentic subject. You know, and that's something where have you ever read Frantz Fanon? He has a very famous...
Yeah, F-A-N-O-N.
His book, Black Skin, White Mask, where he's talking about the idea of colonialism and post-colonialism, the way Europe had inscribed the idea of subjectivity on people of color, and the Middle East. He was talking about the Algerian War and the way that the rebellion and the claiming of subjectivity from Europe was this crisis of eruption of noise.
Yeah, right.
So, at the end of the day, if you're looking at hybridity, which is what I think a lot of the stuff we're talking about is kind of focusing on, my nickname for it is, when you talk about the industrial underpinnings, that's where I was pointing out Pine and Gilmore, the experience economy. You're looking at this idea of, some people are calling it the attention economy, where there's too many claims on the attention of the subject, and your attention's being pulled simultaneously in the futurists had a term omnidirectional, which I love that term, omnidirectional. It's like your mind is never focused on one thing. It's just the way we live. What's the next generation of artists? Do you guys have any ideas of what artists will be doing in 10 years from now? I think it would be video games. It's going to be a lot of critique of the idea of physical presence in space. Do you need to be someplace?
After the invention of photography, painting stopped developing narrative the way you seem to like, and after Tristram Shandy and other things, the novels and Don Quixote, the novels started changing the way it developed narrative.
Well, don't get me wrong. It's not going to stop. I totally reject the product. As I said, it's not the process per se. It's just the practice. And I was being very specific, talking about VJs as they've been. I'm just so sick of going to clubs and raves and concerts, and it's all just the same bluff. I just want them to stop.
I would actually contend with the point that it is the process. I believe that in 10 years' time, I believe that the forward-thinking artist is going to be thinking about the process and commenting on the process. Mm-hmm. It is not and to me, this is the problem, and I think this is sort of what you're getting at indirectly, is that in a lot of cases there really doesn't seem to be any skill behind what's being created. It seems to be very random. It seems to be very, just inauthentic. It's just, I just did it and I don't know why and it worked, so hooray, this is fantastic.
The point is
But there was a choice. The choice makes it authentic.
Like you
and I understand
the light surgeons, those guys are fucking brilliant. I mean, this isn't done right. But
part of the good thing of it is that maybe some of these new art is that more people can do it. So who cares if it's bad or good in your opinion, right? If it's genius or not. But more people producing more things isn't necessarily bad. If people have an access to art and it not being something you like, that doesn't matter.
And by the way, there's record levels of kids graduating from art schools at this point. There's more than ever. So you're going to be seeing a huge wave of this kind of stuff.
I know.
I definitely think that I don't consider myself a VJ. I consider myself a sound artist dealing with certain collision points between visual material, and I say material, I'm speaking abstractly. I could remix a painting as easily as I could remix a video. And in fact, I have. I mean, so the idea of the remix is probably, that's something I'm going to get into later today. The ontology of the remix, looking at the idea of, again, subjectivity and the idea of authentic expression. I mean, you're talking about how people, what's the criteria of judgment for quality of remixes, for example. When you hear a Danger Mouse mashup of the Beatles versus Jay-Z's Black Album, what's the criteria of judgment? And is there a specific, because if the Beatles hated it, which they did, then later on Paul McCartney said, well, when I heard this stuff, he cut up all our songs and just slapped this.
He's just pissed he's not getting paid.
So when one person, say for example, the tools of another era, you're talking about the industrialization like in the 19th century. The saxophone became the emblem of the beginning of the 20th century. Most people will argue it's one of the newest instruments to the vocabulary. The pianos had hundreds of years, the violins had hundreds of years, the laptops barely had 20 years. So it's a meta instrument that can be any other instrument. If I want to simulate the saxophone or simulate a violin or simulate, all of that is programmable. Bells, whatever sound I want, if I can think about it, you can usually edit and program and come up with a sound form that's pretty similar. So as a composer, it's like I have to narrow the field because there's almost, whenever I sit down to write a new song, okay, I'm like, which direction do I want to go? Do I want to do rock? Do I want to do hip hop? Do I want to do classical? Do I want to do techno? Do I want to do noise? I took the sound of ice and made a symphony out of that because I took a studio down in Antarctica. By the way, the second part of today, we're going to be talking about more nature and stuff like that. Today, at the beginning, I wanted to get you guys into this idea of the crisis between repetition and noise, and above all, this idea, again, just like
the crisis of realism is a great point. And I don't know if it's, I'm wondering if the crisis isn't the crisis of realism, but it's the crisis surrounding our notions of reality constitution, the whole...
Like, say, for example, Nick last night, the way he critiqued Mitchell was he's saying, okay, where's the people of color? And meanwhile, you were seeing a kind of a computer model of a car with an android-looking person. There was not, to me, there was no subjective ethnicity at all to the model of people. And so he was projecting his own inner thing. I believe he might be gay. He seems, so he was projecting his own internal crisis perhaps onto something that was a blank slate, which we all do. We all carry our own internal dynamic, and we look for it in specific things.
But he did have a fundamentally good point, which was who's going to build this stuff?
Right, the labor and the kind of physicality of the labor. That's something I'm very intrigued by because most of my work dealing with software and digital media, it's basically me sitting in a studio and I work alone, and then I send my files out to my assistant. We even got rid of our office because we'd all be sitting in the office staring at our computers, and I was spending a fortune for my office on 14th Street. I was like, you guys, we could all work at home, and I could save a lot of money and get rid of the office. And we just send files back and forth. Nobody's in the same room. So getting rid of the office was kind of like this revelation for me. I was like, it's funny, most artists have their studio. Like, you have your print shop, right?
Yeah.
It's a physical space.
Yeah.
You come in the morning or afternoon.
Well, yeah, but often when I work with an artist, I go to their studio. It might be in another state or another place, and you kind of have to create a virtual shop on the spot, Do
you work digitally, or is it mainly with analog tools?
I do work digitally when a project requires it, but I tend to prefer the older methods.
Mm-hmm. Now, would you say most of you guys have normal studios, a place where you go to create, right? The studio still sort of resonates with artists. The studio for me is my cell phone, and that's my office too. I mean, I could be anywhere. I could be sitting on a friggin' mountain making a track and send the track to my studio back in New York and have it mastered. I don't.
There has to be printing equipment somewhere.
Yeah. So you still need physical.
Yeah, you need space. Yeah.
So there's paradoxes here, because if the studio is totally portable, if I'm carrying a studio across a glacier in Antarctica, you know, and it's hard to describe the fact that I'm bringing the entire logic of a civilization on my back with me, you know, to use my tools to be able to work. And I'm sitting on a glacier for 8 hours watching some ice melt, you know, I mean, it's... Now, how do you make a collage out of that? I mean, it's like, these are issues that I think many artists are going to be facing. And the idea of there's a whole movement of saying that the studio, a lot of museum shows are including artist studios in the actual exhibition these days, like Rick, you know, stuff, where he'll literally just set up a studio in the middle of the museum, and that's the exhibition. Liam Gillick is also sort of trendy for what they call the new conceptualism. You know, I'm placing this stuff specifically in an art world and probably contemporary dance aesthetic rather than a normal club thing, because like I'm not even showing you guys the club stuff I do, because I don't really, I DJ all over the world all the time, and I don't really feel like talking about it because I do it all the time. It's like, you know, it's boom, boom, yeah, everybody, hey, you know, it's whatever, like party mix, you know. But I enjoy playing party tracks and DJing and stuff, but that's an accidental side effect of a series of projects that were basically looking at 90s collage. So when I put my album out, Songs of Dead Dreamer was my first album. DJ Shadow put his album out, introducing DJ Crush put his album out. Mine, of all of my peer group, Kid Koala, Cut Chemist, DJ Shadow, Kid, you know, all those guys just wanted to make normal club mixes. That was it. Like, that's based on sampling. Mine was an art project with like extended liner notes. We did this whole pictorial history of sampling, you know, it was a limited edition thing. But word got out about it, and we ended up selling around 60,000 copies. But, you know, same thing with this weird iPhone app thing, where we put it out I put it out mainly as an art project, thinking about a social sculpture tool. And we've had 1 million downloads without any advertising, without. So I'm still processing on that. I mean, every other day I get an alert from my software team, like, oh, we just had another 300,000 downloads. I'm like, who the hell is, you know, downloading? I was on the subway the other day. I saw kids DJing with the software, you know, and they were ignoring each other. Everybody was just like kind of like DJing from their cell phone. And I realized, okay, so these are random people who I have no idea are interacting with my work. I have no idea who these people are. And as an artist, it's eerie because you can't track the response. Right? I mean, you can. We can find out who's downloading it and where, actually, because iTunes tracks geographically. If you sort of pull the hood up, they allow you to find out who's, you know, the geographic region, and then people can do feedback mechanisms and type. But that's the only other thing. I mean, Seamster-wise and you know, that kind of thing. Everything you're talking about, the mulch engine, it's very delusional, actually, if you think about the philosophy of the abstract machine and rhizomatic artworks that can move through network systems. This is it. I mean, it's taken my whole production process and made a little cell phone app out of it. It's kind of, it's, for me as an artist, it's like, wait a second, something's missing, you know, my arm is gone or something. It's like, that my first, I'll hang that thought 1 second, is, you know, when I first started DJing, it was meant to be an art project about the uncanny. You know, when you press play, there's nobody there. And Sigmund Freud had this term called the unheimlich, which is essentially when you assign qualities to people or to objects. And he was writing about E.T.A. Hoffman's The Sandman, which is a classic for the idea of the uncanny. But he also wrote about being lost in the city and walking around and getting lost and keep looping back. And the city's landscape became this repetition landscape. So he ended up writing this one essay called The Uncanny, which is really, a couple other professors are going to be talking about that later this year, so I didn't want to touch on it too much. But the uncanny, to me at least, is one of the underlying architectures of the 20th century, because people were bombarded with objects that they could barely absorb, objects that they didn't know how technologically to work, and they're viewed as almost magical. That's what this idea of magic realism, and a lot of people playing with that. Orson Welles was a magician, by the way. And Méliès, at the beginning of the 20th century, he was a magician who wanted to apply magic tricks to film.
Right.
So, you know, you guys remember that clip I played the other day where he make copies of himself? That was a magic trick. People paid 5 cents, which was a lot of money maybe back then, to come into a weird little theater, 2-minute clip. It was like mind-blowing for them. Wow. Or to see if the train was coming out of the screen, people would get up and run because they felt the train would come out. So our current moment is I don't think we've had enough time to absorb all these tools, and it's still just a bombarded and like a hyper-accelerated and very dense ocean of information, you know, we're engaging. By the way, so Alejo, you had a...
Yeah, I just want to know, because it's more like an artist, as an artist, what's your position? Yeah, that's more or less the question, because the free art is not such a free art, you know, it's being used by art to, as you said, to track, to map these digital traces, to download, very download, you know, it's used intensively to try to market new products, you know, to try to sell new things. So for me, sometimes it's important to try not to leave traces online. I mean, this is what Len Manovich was talking last year. He talked about the digital divide, a new digital divide. That is the one that is about the ones who leave traces and the ones that don't leave traces.
Yeah, I mean, people who are wealthy enough to be invisible.
Yeah, exactly. Or you become suspicious immediately if you don't have a credit card and mobile phone, and you avoid some patterns. You immediately become suspicious of the system. But my question is more, I mean, as you know, art sometimes rejects, there's many possible positions regarding what you call it an art piece, you call it a social sculpture. And I don't know, because it's integrated into that economy, into that, you know, marketing economy in such a strong way that I don't know if I can allow that category in, you know.
Okay.
I don't know what you think.
Do you, okay, if you use a cell phone, you're engaging with the network already, right? You have to be able to send and receive messages, that's a network. Now, if an artist is sending and receiving messages, which a painting sends a message, you know, a sculpture sends a message, you know, people respond to the semiotic relationship of web. It's a semiotic web of relationship.
Certainly, but I'm asking more about the use that Apple is doing to that, what they're doing, you know, how they're property.
No, but anyone who's using these technological tools is involved with a production network already. You're using a laptop, and you know the network is implicit in the software that you're using, the open source media, everything. So it's a semiotic web.
Precisely, I'm trying very much to see where I place myself using this media.
I mean, there's one artist who tried to erase all the data about him from Facebook a little while ago. The idea of Facebook suicide. And you couldn't because Facebook was all, you know, all these weird little cached bits and pieces. I barely mess with Facebook because
just don't get on it. And you'll
it takes way too much time.
But that's not true. You're not invisible because you're tagged in other people's stuff. So
That's true. Yeah.
So there's people who are doing funny things about clicking on too many friends to the point where your identity becomes so immersed in all these other people that you effectively vanish. And so there is no there because you're too many friends and too many people, and there is no censor because you're just clicked on all these other people as friends and accepted all these zillions of friends on Facebook or something. I don't personally. Maybe 2 years from now, when Facebook's dead, I hope.
I still do Friendster.
You still do Friendster?
No, I'm joking.
Yeah. I mean, it's a weird. I do like just. My phone never rings well. I don't know if you guys noticed that, but I have a huge social network of people that I have to deal with for email constantly. I just thought about just in the email. I hate talking on the phone. It's just a pain in the neck. But this device, I pay my bills online, and if somebody wanted to hack my credit card, which God knows, Hendrik, I don't know if you guys know about Hendrik and his little hacking. You know, it's funny because I have this one credit card strictly online that I keep a very small amount, and we can tell it's getting, you know, used or whatever. And then I have another credit card because I travel a lot. Like one of the classic things, like if I'm in Sudan, which is under full U.S. sanctions, none of my credit cards work because the companies all have this very weird abstract. They just don't work. Like you can't charge anything. I had to go straight to cash, you know, because I couldn't. So I had to change my money at Frankfurt Airport, and then I had to sign a waiver that the money. Because it's a long story. It's an eerie thing when you talk about these economies. Apple won't sell computers in Sudan, but the Chinese will, you know, and you will be able to see bootlegs of everything. If you go to Khartoum, the market, everything was crazy, weird Chinese bootlegs of everything, because none of the normal companies would sell stuff there. And it was actually much like eerily, you know, I had no idea of the quality of the bootlegs. You know, if you go to down to Chinatown in New York, on Canal Street, as soon as the iPhone came out later that afternoon, there was lines around the block for all these people to go to these Chinese stores to get their phones cracked, you know, to erase the codecs and the various data. And then Apple heard about it because the Apple store is in Soho, and then they sent out a weird signal making everyone's phone had gotten, that afternoon, the day the phone came out, the people's phones got turned into bricks. And it was this big controversy because Apple, and recently even, the guy, Amazon had a weird dispute with a couple book publishers, so people turned on their phones and their books had vanished. You know?
Yeah, the book was 1984.
Yeah, that's
I know.
So I hear you on that. I mean, it is this kind of eerie sense of webs and networks sticking to everything you do. I mean, it's like the problem I think that the artist faces, and the composer and the writer, is navigating density, like being able to funnel those webs and networks into stronger, more robust art. I mean, I think that's what Mitchell was kind of talking about with this idea of how the city is a machine in its own right, you know, and I think the artist responds to that machine. There's inputs, there's outputs, and we need to figure them out. And that's the art form of living in an urban, now globalized city, you know. So these networks are very eerie, even here we're in the middle of the Swiss Alps, and if I wanted to walk to the mountain, I'm on full signal up throughout this whole mountain. And a couple of years ago, remember, nobody was able to get their phones working. You know, now we're full bar, everything, you know, even in the most remote part of this mountain, even in Antarctica. I had a satellite cell phone just in case if I fell through a glacier and broke my leg, I'd be able to call for help, which, God, I mean, it would take 10 hours for a flight from Argentina to reach the middle of some glacier. But if I fell and broke my leg, you know, I didn't use the phone because it would cost a fortune, you know, because I had it turned off, but I always had implicit that there was a network that the phone would reach, and I could call for help, just in case, you know. So, yeah, is there a place on this earth where those networks don't reach anymore? You know, I think these are questions artists and writers and composers are facing right now. It's this omnipresent. So instead of the futurists saying, let's erase the museums and let's blow up the galleries and the symphonies, maybe the new futurists would say we need to understand these networks and maybe do some other kind of take on them.
Or get rid of them. Yeah, I mean, the thing that I read yesterday, if it's killing the bees, what do you want? An iPhone or food? You know, this is, and so it could be that the new futurists would say, yeah, turn your back on modernism. Let it sink into the mists of history.
Well, you know the history of the Luddites, I'm sure, right? You know.
Oh yeah. But this isn't even Luddism. This is like just let it. You don't have to break it; it'll kill itself.
I mean, these are all toxic objects. I mean, if you think about plastic, if you let your skin absorb, because your skin is always absorbing, it wants to absorb everything around it. Like if you wore your clothes, they would eventually wear off because the chemicals in your skin and stuff like that would drop the clothing away. But same thing with plastic. So that's for later.
I think Mitchell would disagree with that. He seemed to be really into plastic.
He has soy-grown plastic.
Yeah.
And that's biodegradable.
Yeah.
There's additional formulas you can use to make weird materials. Like he's really into materials. He was regretfully, I think the only negative about last night's line of questioning is that the guy was like, "Why do we need cities?" And I think it's the opposite. I think we need to get rid of the suburbs altogether and have human beings move into the city and not get out of ruining all of it and despoiling all of the landscape around the cities. So we'll focus on cities and let nature go back to its own. The greenest place in Europe right now, believe it or not, is Chernobyl, because people withdrew, and it's actually this eerie place of like birds, like paradise, you know, like creatures that like relaxed, and they've even got out of the fight or flight mechanism, so deer aren't scared of people. They just look at you like, what are you doing here? You know, like, so it's like this weird place, like little blip of intense green, even if you see it from satellite now. So stuff like that. Anyway, we should wrap up. When we come back, I'm going to be looking at Basquiat's paintings and language of erasure. We're going to be looking at some of these ideas of visual noise, and then sort of updating from these ideas of networks into thinking about complexity. So, any comments? Wrap up, critique. I hope everybody thought the R. Kelly thing was kind of funny. I don't know.
Yeah,